Thought Media Network. We are a global broadcast network of positive music, media, and entertainment, inspiring humanity's evolution along the journey of enlightenment and creating a world of love, peace, empowerment, and prosperity for all. New Thought Media Network. Positively inspiring.
Hey everybody, Tracy Brown here. Welcome. It's Tuesday. It is right afternoon Mountain Time. And so that means it is time for the Inclusive Church, where every week we come together and talk about, think about, commit to being leaders in churches and spiritual communities where oneness does not require or expect sameness. And this month, the month of September 2025, we're focusing on the book Finding Refuge, Hard Work for Healing Collective Grief by Michelle Cassandra Johnson. No accident that a few weeks ago I pulled this book out just to recommend it as a resource. And I hadn't, looked at it in over a year. And when I pulled it off the shelf thinking it would be a good resource to share, I opened it and started reading it. And maybe you were watching the show that week, and you heard me realize about 20 minutes or 30 minutes into the show that, oh my goodness, we really need to do this book together. We need to really talk about it. So that's what is happening now in the month of September. Before we dive into today's theme, I want you to know a couple of things that I always try to share for context. So the show is The Inclusive Church, and we're on the New Thought Media Network. And a few times people have said, well, we're not churches, we're spiritual centers, or we're not churches, we're spiritual community. We're churches. At least the reason I'm using inclusive church is to reclaim the word church so that we stop thinking about church as a piece of property where we go, and instead recommit to church being a gathering of people in whatever form that happens on a regular basis, so that we can learn spiritual practice together, practice our spiritual practices and principles in real life as a community. And so that's one thing I always try to share. And then second, um, that I often will refer to use the word leaders, and several people said to me early in the beginning weeks of this show, well, you keep saying leaders, so I thought it was for ministers only. Well, if the only leaders in your church are ministers, then I'm not sure I would trust that you're going to grow and thrive and all of that. Almost every minister I've ever talked to about this agrees that their role is really important, and they couldn't do church without having leaders in music, leaders in fundraising, leaders in leading volunteer teams, leaders who were helping to organize all the activities and all of the functioning of the church. So when I'm saying leaders who are inclusive, I mean all kinds of leaders. And so if you're not a minister, good for you. You're still a leader. And please share the show with other leaders in your community. We've got a good afternoon from Anita. Hello, hello, hello. And if any of the others of you who I can see are watching we're live streaming from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different platforms right now. If you want to say hello, please let us know who you are and where you are watching in the chat or in the comments if you're on YouTube. Okay, is there anything else? Anything else? So we're today in the book Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. We are going to be talking about chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5 is Ushering Us, and chapter 6 is The Hive Mind. And my featured guest today is Claire Holston, and we are going to just dive on in. So let me get Claire on the screen with me. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Hi, Tracy. Great to be here.
So, Claire, give people just a little bit about who you are, because if I start talking about you, I'll go on for like 5 or 6 minutes and all the reasons why I invited you to hang out with me today. So give people the, 2-minute version.
Yeah, there you go. So, yes, welcome everyone. Happy to be here. So I'm a licensed spiritual practitioner through CSL, and I'm also a practitioner and a minister through the International Metaphysic Ministry. I'm currently located over here in New Hampshire, where we're entering into the fall season. It's come a little bit sooner than I would like. I'm part of the virtual practitioner program, and I'm also an activist, very much involved in the local community over here in New Hampshire. I was born and raised in Connecticut, went to school in Massachusetts, and moved up to New Hampshire about over 30 years ago now, where I live with my wife and our huskies. I think that's all.
That's a lot. That's a lot. And this book, Finding Refuge, if you're watching and you have been following along, then you already know that we've been doing like a couple of chapters at a time. And this overall, one of the reasons I think this book is so important in the context of being inclusive is because from the very beginning of the book, Michelle Cassandra Johnson lays this context of how there is collective pain from many of the societal standards and norms and practices that we all live with. And so, whether that is racism or whether that is homophobia, or whether that is discomfort with people from different socioeconomic levels, that many of us, many of us are impacted in a negative way. And even if we're the dominant group or the group that the norms are set around, we lose too, because that members of that group lose the impact of and the creativity of and the productivity of people who are in the groups that often are marginalized or stereotyped in a negative way. And that and so my concept is, if we in our spiritual communities are wanting to be inclusive, we have to make space for hearing, learning about, understanding, and then healing the grief that members of different groups are experiencing because they're not able to show up as their whole self. And the other part of that is, it helps us to be more inclusive when we are curious about what is someone else's experience. And in metaphysics and New Thought, we are good about saying, well, there's only one thing happening here, or there's only one person here, right? What happens to you, I am impacted by as well. And we say that, but often in our churches, we don't actually live that. We're all one for the good stuff. But when we are finding out or hearing about or experiencing separation in our community, it's kind of like, oh, well, Tracy, oh, I know another Black man was killed by the police, but that's horrible. And you do what you need to do to like heal. Well, no. If I'm in a multiracial, multi-ethnic church, then I need everybody to understand how that impacts them. So how that impacts them, not that they're doing something to make me feel better, but we're co-creating the world we live in. So that's one of the reasons why I got so excited about, oh, this book is something that those of us who want to be inclusive, really need to go through together. And it's not just head work, it's heart work. And so, as it's come up already in the first few weeks, how powerful the spiritual practices are at the end of each chapter. Whew. So, with all of that preamble, I'm just going to ask you, Claire, in chapter 5, which is ushering us, what really, what one or two things really stood out for you, or you found yourself underlining them or writing notes in the margin? What captured you in chapter 5?
Yeah, what really stood out for me initially was when she was talking about her family and how she was talking about her grandmother and the traditions around, Thanksgiving and stuff like that. And it made me remember that the strong I had grandmothers. I didn't really have grandfathers that were in the picture. My mother didn't talk about her father. And then my grandfather on my father's side died when I was very young. So my grandparents are both were down in South Carolina. So I would go and visit them, but they weren't really in my life all the time. So then I was like, okay, so who are my next role models, right? Or those ancestors. And it brought me to my parents. So my mom is 92 and a half, and my dad is going to be 87 in December. And so it almost started me preparing for what are the strong points or legacies, right, that they've instilled in me, and that as I prepare myself for, their transition, what would I carry with them? So my dad is very big on Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving is very important to him. And it was always about the family coming together, traveling from wherever we may have been in the States to come together collectively as a group of people. And he loved that holiday. And my mother loves Christmas. So, when I look at the calendar, it's like near the end of the year is generally when we prepare to travel from New Hampshire down to Connecticut to spend time with them. And then the second piece that came in is, the strong foundation that I had with my parents. My parents moved from what I call the inner city out into the suburbs, which was predominantly white. And what did they teach me, right? The values around being strong, facing adversity. But my parents were always there, and they instilled in me how you treat people, right? That irregardless of the circumstances or the environments that you're in, you work hard, you treat people with respect, irregardless of the challenges that you may face. So it really brought me back to appreciating what I have, the relationship that I have with my parents, as I prepare to, try to carry on and live out what they've instilled in me. So that's really what I took initially from that chapter.
I absolutely was pulled in this chapter by, throughout the book, the author does a really good job of sharing specific examples through stories about how she navigated or the impact on her of real life situations involving family or friends or the community. And in this chapter, starting with that whole framing around grandmother and how these traditions come to be and what they mean to the well-being of the family, and how you learn all this stuff and you don't even realize you're learning it. And so I loved that. And it was a perfect entry point because the quote at the beginning of the chapter is this one from Clarissa Pinkola Estes. Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach. Repeating, ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but instead to stretch out to simply mend that part of the world that is within our reach. And as that's Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And that, for me, as a person of African descent, I really resonated with this whole story about the family because for so many years, decades, centuries, for people of the African diaspora in the US especially, or anywhere really where there has been colonialism, sometimes all you could reach was your family, right? It was and it was important when I think about how the values I learned, and my family in many ways wasn't nearly as close as some families I know, but the patterns and the family of the church I was in growing up was so critical to not only my self-esteem, not only my spiritual grounding, but giving me that sense of yeah, the world needs to be fixed, and here you're safe, or here you're seen, or here you're valued. And probably for me, that's why I do some of the work that I do, even though it wasn't a conscious connection, but wanting to make the world a place where people could be seen and valued, no matter the fact that they are different from maybe what is considered the norm.
Hmm.
And I don't think I've ever really framed it that way before this very moment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree. And, it's always, growing up and most recently too, right? There's a lot of reasons to be angry. But that foundation has always been, what do I do with that anger, right? So it's really trying to redirect it in a way that I can bridge the gap a little bit with the different communities that I do interact with. How do I take this anger and make something of a positive out of it? And a lot of times it is sharing my story, sharing my experience of what it is to grow up in predominantly white areas, being in, corporate America and being the only Black woman sitting at the table. But a lot of my anti-racist work is just to try to help people be better people and have a better understanding. So yes, I relate to that very much.
Yeah, I'm just breathing that in. And in this chapter, I I'm going to read a section on the bottom of page 89. Um, in the ambulance, two things occurred. So she's in the ambulance with her grandmother who's being rushed to the hospital. So in the ambulance, two things occurred that I will never forget. The paramedic driving the ambulance looked at me and asked, "What did you do today?" To which I replied, "I went to my father's memorial." The ambulance driver looked how I felt, like this was unbelievable. I haven't heard of many people attending a memorial service for one of their parents preceding their grandparent having a stroke on the same day. Then I heard the paramedics in the back say, Miss Young, stay with us." This is when I knew my grandmother was dying. And in the quote, and then she goes on to tell, the story of, how what happened and how even being in the hospital, where at one point she said, quote, "Wait, she's a person. Her name is Dorothy, and she is my grandmother. My desire was to have the medical professionals humanize her as she transitioned. We deserve to be humanized, especially as we are dying," end quote. And I thought, we have such, society wide, we have such an unhealthy relationship and regard for death. And um, I remember the first time I read this chapter, being all in this story about family and relationships and the grandmother and the not so good relationship with the father and the responsibilities we have. And I remember being kind of torn back and forth between family is so important, and at the same time, not we don't owe people just because they are family. And then going over here to, but when family is woven together, where there is support and where you're learning, no matter what your family structure is. You're learning about values. You're learning. I mean, there are things and values I have that I learned to because I wanted to be the opposite of what I was seeing in some family members, right? It made me more loving and more open. So as I was reading, I was back and forth until he got to this point, and which is probably why, I have it asterisk. That whole piece of wait, we live and live and live, and then what is the way? How do we handle death? How do we handle this transition? So, Claire, when you talked about, it's making you think about, whoa, my parents are older. What a blessing. What a
Hmm.
blessing. They have lived so many decades, right?
Hmm. Yes.
And at the same time, how can we ensure that they are humanized even as they may be closer to death?
Yeah. The last October, actually, well, over the last couple of years, my dad has experienced having kidney cancer and had a kidney removed. And he's had processes of going through the hospital, going through rehab, right? And I found myself having to be an advocate for him. But I've watched him age, right? Both mentally and physically from, the trauma of being a healthy, strong man to suddenly finding himself not capable of doing the things that he's always been able to do. And so I've transitioned, in a way that, and my sister's down there with them, that we're moving into that caretaker role, right? That, um, and I also, without going into a whole lot of details, during one of his falls and ended up in the hospital, I discovered some financial um, issues that I had to resolve with him. And I found myself at a place where I was trying to be gentle with him. It's almost like the roles had reversed a little bit. And what I said to my dad, and I say this to both of my parents, is I'm grateful and thankful for all that you have given me to date. I want your remaining years to be peaceful, right? And so while we were even in the hospital, I had to be the advocate, right? I'm pushing the doctors, I'm pushing the nurses, right, to humanize them and not just make them a number. And so it's an experience, and it's a transition for all of us. But yes, every day is a blessing because I don't know when, right? So we make every effort to be gentle with them as we usher them along, as they've ushered us to this point. So
I'm smiling because with all that's going on in my brain, I'm like, oh yeah, that, and then that, and then that, and then and it's like, oh, highlight this and then share this part. And then I realized just now that, oh, that'll take us another 20 minutes and we'll never get to chapter 6. So I'm not gonna go through all of those, but I love, since we talked about this framing in this chapter, it is all about, the dad and then the memorial service and the grandmother dying on the day of the memorial service, and or having the stroke and on the day of the memorial service and then dying, and what happens when she, the author, and with other relatives, goes to clean out the grandmother's home, and all the insights, like all of these different pieces of life coming together in a relatively short period of time. And right, the chapter title is Ushering Us. The us, the us. Who is the us? The us is me and all of the people who have helped to shape my life. So in the latter part, and toward the end of the chapter, the last few pages, she does an awesome job of bringing forth the willingness to ask for support and guidance from the ancestors, the ones you know and the ones that you may not know. And so on page 98, in the middle of the page, she writes, if you are just beginning to work with your ancestors, I encourage you to only invite in ancestral energy that will support your highest good. Ask for ancestors who are healthy and well to support you. If you find it difficult to engage with people in your bloodline, you might consider engaging the natural world as a living ancestor. Sometimes it is easier to work with elemental energies because air, fire, water, earth, and wood are things many of us have access to in some form. And so, while, much of this chapter is about the human ancestor, and much of it is about the ancestors in the last 3 or 4 pages, she does broaden that to ancestors you may not have known personally, but are in the bloodline, in your bloodline or in your cultural line. And then here, right before she goes to spiritual practice, she brings in the elements as well. So it's a very, very full chapter. It's one of the longer chapters in the book. And then in the spiritual practice, it is all about calling in ancestral support. So my question for you, Claire, is, yes, you're a licensed practitioner in religious science, but you are also an ordained interfaith minister. And so when we talk about this book being important for spiritual communities, leaders in spiritual communities to read it and to do some of the practices, but maybe even, like reading the book together as a book of the month or in groups. What, from your perspective, what kind of value is there in using this in a spiritual community?
Yeah, I think it intertwines our past with our present.
Yeah.
Right. In that we recognize that, there is a connection, intergenerational, if we're talking about within the bloodline, right? But that impact how we show up today, both individually and collectively. And so when we take this spiritually and put it into the community, I think it helps ground people, so that they get an understanding of the connectiveness, and that we have a shared responsibility, not just as leaders, but guiding one another into wholeness. And it also requires humility. I think that, we usher in, even as we heal, we grieve, and that we hold space, right, with gentleness, being present, building trust, and not controlling or fixing, I think is part of the quote. So those are some of the things that come to mind.
Yeah. And it's, I hear you and I both, we've been actively involved in communities that are racially mixed and that are mixed in terms of, having people who come from all different kinds of backgrounds, professionally and socioeconomically. So I hear somebody saying, well, we just read this chapter together and she's a Black woman and it's just all about how Black families relate. What's that got to do with me? I'm not Black. And I'm curious how you would respond to that reaction from someone who is in a community that is trying to navigate this heart work for healing collective grief.
Well, again, you know, we all have experiences, right, that show up, how we show up every day. So just because I, as a Black woman, tell you that this is my experience, doesn't mean that your experience is any more or any less, right? And I don't know, I guess I struggle with that type of a comment because, we all have work to do, right? And that taking the time to understand, your history and your experience, and how is it impacting the way in which you show up on a day-to-day basis. We all are pretty much searching for the same thing, right? At the end of the day, we want to be seen, we want to be heard, but to say that you're different, we're all one, right? I don't know if I answered that very well, but
well, it's not like there's a right or a wrong answer, right? It's just
yeah.
like, yeah, I don't know what I would say exactly, but it's like, oh yeah, what would I be thinking about to frame my response to someone saying that? Because, and I think as a person of color, it is interesting because in general, in most of my life, most white people assume that they can tell their experience from their context and I'm supposed to get it. Right? They just automatically assume that. But when I'm telling my story from a Black perspective, they're like, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me. There's no value in that story for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the reasons I feel strongly this is the kind of book that can be done in community because it brings a highlight to that. Oh, when I'm in the room and there's someone who is speaking Spanish and they grew up in Mexico, even though they have lived in the United States and speak English very well, and they've lived in the US for, more than 20 years, it's still their story is from the perspective of the Latino community.
Mm-hmm.
And do I have the skill and the experience and the willingness to step into their story and how it impacted them? And sure, I might think of something that's similar in my own experience, but it's actually a skill that we need to practice to be able to get out of our own box
Mm-hmm.
and hear authentic experiences of others and be there with them,
Mm-hmm.
not separating them. And I do this work a lot, and still I have to consciously choose to do that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I have a better understanding now what you're saying. Yeah, one of the things that I know I've experienced a lot is, even when we try to explain the experience to people, I get, no, that's not right. And I'm like, so then I have to get into a battle with people about, look, this is my experience. You have no right to tell me that that's not my lived experience, right? So I challenge people often to say, can you just maybe stop and think about it, right? And I try to, and I do that. I really do that with other people because I am interested in, what if I did put myself into those shoes and try to feel an experience, right? Because it helps me relate better. And maybe I'll have some questions, right? Around, what is that experience like for you? Talk to me about it. And it engages us in conversation that takes us to a deeper level. So we actually get to humanize one another and we can see one another in our differences. So, yeah. and to challenge.
Well, I love that, and every week I'm always, so far as we've been going through this book, I hear myself saying, and you really might want to, if any of this sounds interesting, you really might want to buy this book. And I'm really glad that I've had this book on my shelf for a few years, and I'm really, really glad that a few weeks ago it, crossed the radar of my mind, and you referred to it because this month feels so rich of being able to dive into this chapter by chapter. The spiritual practice at the end of chapter 5 is about calling in. It's a meditation, and it is focused on calling in ancestral support as we navigate the world today. And I think I think this is my favorite spiritual practice in the entire book. For I don't know really why, but for many reasons, including the reminder that whatever I'm going through now, there have been people who've gone through that and more, and I'm still here, and I'm here to like run my leg of the relay race. And the but the spiritual practice, the way it's designed, is just very, very, very sweet. But we're going to spend the next 10 minutes or so on chapter 6. And chapter 6 is titled The Hive Mind, and the opening quote is this one: "A hive is wholeness. One bee experiences all that every bee experiences. There is no separation. Whereas you have separation, we are born into a world beyond the borders of singularity. Our first thought is always of the hive, to bear increase in the world as we sing the world into aliveness." And it's a quote from Jacqueline Freeman from the Song of Increase: "Listening to the wisdom of honeybees for kinder beekeeping and a better world." And so I loved the whole concept for this chapter, going beyond just our family or our cultural group as our ancestors influencing who we are and how we are and what we know and what we don't know and all of that. And then expanding right into, wait a minute, it's a beehive. So you can think of that with just your family, but the encouragement in this chapter to realize, you know what, we're all in this together. There really is only one, and there is one thing happening. And within that oneness, we're still individuals, right? We're still individuals, but we are, stuck in this hive called the world or earth together. And so, I didn't do it, but I remember thinking, I'm just going to take those first two sentences. A hive is wholeness. One bee experiences all that every bee experiences. There is no separation, end quote. And I was thinking, just type that and put it on a piece of paper and put it, in 2 or 3 places around the house as a reminder. And I've done that with a couple of other quotes. And I was like, okay, Tracy, you've already got like 3 quotes in the bathroom and 4 quotes in the kitchen and, 8 quotes on the wall in front of me in my office. So it's like, we're not going to add that one right now. But I really loved it, this chapter, because of that. The hive mind. What stood out or jumped out, if anything, for you in this chapter?
Yes, I actually really enjoyed this. As I certainly learned a lot about bee collecting. Bees are not my favorite. But the takeaway for me just illustrates, and I think it's kind of reflective in society today, right? That I think we have a lot of individualism that goes on. that's taking place today, and whereby the work that I do, and I know that others do, is for the collective, right? That whilst I know that I fight for, things in the Black community, it's a benefit to all. And this just like really resonated that, it takes a village, right? It takes all of us to work together, to protect one another. The different levels of bees that she described in there, and the work that they have to do, and the fact that they're protecting, the queen, and willing to die for the queen and stuff like that. But it was a beautiful illustration of insects that I'm not fond of, that just showed what we can do when we work together, as opposed to just worrying about our individual needs, right? And how we can change the community, how we can change the world if we could just come together collectively. Is really what stood out for me.
Yeah. As we were making this kind of transition from one chapter to the other, Anita posted, I try my best to be present in the moment and what is. I may later process its impact on to me. It becomes a learning process. And I love this, Anita, because of one, kind of as an individual, that is so healthy and so needed, like be present in the moment now, and then also do some reflection so that there's something taken from whatever happened in that conversation or whatever happened in that circumstance. And at the same time, we we begin to recognize we are contributing to what happens in an ongoing way, and in the world. So, Clary, you made me smile again. Then you made me smile because I grew up and learned pretty young that I'm actually allergic to bee stings. Like if I get a bee sting, it's not just painful or like, scary in that way, but it can be a trigger for me not be able to breathe. And, when you can't breathe, then you die, and right, et cetera, et cetera. And so bees are not anywhere near my favorite either, bees or wasps, because I may be immune to them now, but because, I had such a horrible experience getting stung as a young child, I don't want to get that close to bees. And what I've learned in this book, and I recently read Mad Honey by Jodi Picoult and Jennifer Boylan, and the whole book is framed around bees and how they live together, and the context of the beehive, and how if we as human beings were to take all of these learnings and lessons from the bees, how different our world would be. So when the author is like on page 105 saying, I was moving through one of the most stressful points in my life, which didn't seem like the optimal time to become a beekeeper without knowing anything about bees. But some beekeepers believe bees choose us. And in my case, they definitely did. And this time around reading the book, what came to mind for me was, wow, I don't know that I consciously chose to be living in this world at this time with all of the political polarity, with all of the issues with climate change, with all of the wars that are going on around the world, with all of the tragedies that we hear about, especially if we follow global news. It's like there are many days where I feel like I didn't choose to kind of corral or serve a world like this, because I have a very different view of how the world can work so that we can have heaven on earth. But what if the bees chose me? Because I have such clarity about heaven on earth, what if I was chosen by the circumstances of time to be present in the world right here, right now? And now I'm part of the hive. So what's my contribution? And Anita adds, yeah, also allergic to bee stings, so I give them wide berth. Grateful for beekeepers and the sweet nectar honey that they produce and the health benefits derived from it. True metaphysician here, like not my thing, but here's what I'm grateful for. But it's like, oh, what if I'm the beekeeper for the earth that we live in, or live on today? What if that's what I've been called to do? And Marjorie, bees, like all animals, have a corresponding mental equivalent, sometimes referred to as an archetype. Like, yes, we know this. We know this. But it did strike me this, in the last week of rereading chapter 6, it's like when I read that sentence, some beekeepers believe bees choose us to be their keeper. And in my case, they definitely did.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we all made a contract that we wanted to be here during this time. And I think a lot of it too is, what is the work for me to do? What's the work for us to do now that we are here? I don't think that it's to not do anything. And where we're being led, where we're being ushered, is to be determined, right? But yeah, we are definitely made to be here at this moment, and
Yeah.
through all the challenges.
I love how in this chapter she goes through the different roles that the different bees play in the successful life of a beehive. And there are some people who I could just recommend this one chapter to, that just read this and then think about, like, what is your role in society? What is your role in your spiritual community or in your church in terms of healing collective grief and being an inclusive community? If you look at it as a beehive, are you a forager bee? Are you a drone bee? Are you, what role are you playing to support the overall success of the collective? And I think that for me is like, yeah, this chapter alone, if people didn't read the whole book, I could do a month's worth of Sunday talks or Wednesday talks from this chapter. Well, at least a month. That could be really helpful. So we have only about 5 minutes, actually less than 5 minutes, to kind of wrap it up. This is another chapter where there are two spiritual practices. One is called Remembering Our True Nature. And I think it goes to, Marjorie, your comment about there is an archetype for every animal, and there's an archetype that supports every need. And the second practice is more of a physical integration, because Michelle Cassandra Johnson is also a yoga instructor, and it's connecting the mind and the body, which in New Thought and metaphysics, we really believe in the mind, body, soul connection. So these are both really great spiritual practices. So let's take a breath and have some closing comments. If there's one thing you want to leave people with or encourage people to think about, what would that be?
Which type of bee do they want to be? And how are you going to show up?
Oh, there is so much there. Which type of bee do you want to be? Oh, okay. I want to play with that, but I don't have time to play with that right now. So, and I don't even have anything to add as a different closing comment, because that's what I want people, having heard it. What I was going to say was like, yeah, no, we don't need to say that. Which type of bee do you want to be? That's how we're going to end today's show. Claire, thank you so much for hanging out with me and talking about this chapter today. I really appreciate your yes. So everybody else, I just want to remind you that I'm here every Tuesday at noon Mountain Time. We spend a little bit of time together diving into the idea and the concept of what it takes to be inclusive in our churches, in our spiritual communities. And in the month of September, the focus is this book, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing. And so next week, I'll be back talking about chapter 7 and the end of the book, and some really great calls to action, both that she recommends and that I want you to be thinking about. So come back and join us, or if you can't join us live on Tuesday at noon Mountain Time, then I invite you to go to YouTube or go to Facebook or go to LinkedIn, wherever you're watching now, and then scroll down and find the recording of the live stream. My name is Tracy Brown, and this is the Inclusive Church, and I can hardly wait until I see you again. Bye for now.
Thanks for watching The Inclusive Church with Tracy Brown. Join us again next week at 12 noon Mountain Time.
On behalf of everyone at New Thought Media Network, thank you for being a member of our virtual family. Your financial contributions help share the New Thought message with people from around the world. Please visit and contribute at www.ntmedia.org/donate. New Thought Media Network. Come be you. And please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, peace and blessings.